A Bitter Taste by Purefoy's Girl. Chapter 5. The last time he had been truly afraid, Will Graham had been 20 years old and facing the certainty that his mother and sister were going to die in the same horrible, obscene way that his father had. The memory of that time had left him with glimpses and shadows of his family, insubstantial as ghosts and twice as haunting. But the fear he had felt then he recalled very, very clearly. It was the same fear that gripped him when Dr. Hannibal Lecter so suddenly surged to his feet to snatch Will's head in his hard hands, fingers hooked behind his nape, forcing Will to look him full in the face on the heels of his pointed comment.
"What do you intend to do now, Will?"
Hannibal asked, the softness of his voice belaying the threatening strength in his hands. Had humans always been so strong? Or was this just another piece of evidence that Will was not the only one?
"Besides provoke me, of course."
Will's lids fluttered for a moment as he wrapped his mind around this sudden, thrilling fear and the deep excitement it elicited. Not entirely healthy, no, but he thought he'd lost the capacity for such excess of sensation, and he needed a moment to greedily bask in it. Hannibal's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly, a hawkish expression of cat-like, cruel interest on his sculpted face as he watched Will's minute reactions.
"Considering I'm going to stay here with you instead of running to the police, should tell you something,"
Will tightly said, forcing the words past the constriction of Hannibal's palms on his jaw. His darkened eyes met Hannibal's own, and he managed to summon a smile despite himself.
"Considering I knew what I was eating, should tell you something else entirely."
His grip loosened so abruptly Will swayed for a moment, steadied by Hannibal's hand on his bare hip, another startling sensation he didn't expect to feel so acutely. He rubbed at his jaw in consternation, saying with a soft laugh,
"You're stronger than you look." "Do I look weak to you, Will?"
Hannibal asked, bending to retrieve his sketchbook and scattered supplies in one graceful, fluid motion.
"Not particularly. But someone stronger than they look when they look like you is really no joke."
Hannibal straightened, that almost smile of delight curling his lips.
"So, we've established that you're staying here with me as a guest in my home, and that you're not overly concerned with social taboos." That's one way to put it, Will thought, his amusement showing on his face. It was one of the drawbacks of having been cursed so young, this face of his. Everything showed on it, or nothing at all, and a blank, dead face fueled by anger, bitterness, and frustration was not exactly the lure he required. "We've also established that you have no qualms eating at my table in the full knowledge of my tastes,"
Hannibal went on, gracing him with another benevolent, assessing look.
"Now we will have to establish precisely what you intend to do while you are here in my home. Besides pose for you,"
Will quipped, aware that he was still very much nude as a grape. Hannibal looked at him slowly from toes to scalp, his eyes tracing the dips and curve of Will's body in a detached but savoring way, lingering on his belly button, the shell of his ear, the bow of his lips, the wayward curls atop his head.
"Tell me, Will, how have you managed to whet your appetites until now?"
he asked, mouth pursing in assessment. Will smiled a little, startled to find himself about to confess in a way he never had. Instinct had always preserved him on that count, a deep core of self-preservation silencing his tongue when the urge to betray himself had risen to the surface. Only that question, and nothing more. That question to them before they died. Two can keep a secret after all, if one of them was dead.
"I'm dead,"
he thought suddenly, and found it amusing enough to laugh aloud to think that his secret would be betrayed by a dead man's lips.
"I eat them, of course,"
he said, his humor fleeing, draining out of him like pus from a wound. He very rarely reflected on the enormity of what he did to survive, having long ago named it a necessity of his curse. But standing there in Hannibal's office with his bare skin kissed with cold, he saw an image of himself reflected backwards through time. Death, and death, and death with no purpose and no end. Killing for the sake of living, stealing time from humanity to claw his way through the ages of his unnatural life for no discernible reason. He felt Hannibal's fingers move slightly over the skin of his hip, where his hand had returned to rest, but it felt far away and unreal.
Will?
What? He softly asked, dragging himself back to the present, momentarily perplexed by the strange room and the man gazing down at him.
I asked you if it bothered you,
Hannibal repeated, moving his hand from Will's hip to his cheek, his gaze sharpening on Will's hazy eyes.
No,
he croaked, wetting his lips with the tip of his tongue, trying to force the heavy, quiet despair away long enough to catch his breath.
Not anymore.
Hannibal's hand smoothed his cheek, thumb tracing just beneath Will's eye. When he blinked, Will felt his long lashes press over Hannibal's impeccably manicured thumbnail, and shivered slightly when Hannibal deliberately brushed his thumb again, perhaps just to feel the feathery touch of Will's lashes on his skin.
Where were you just now?
He asked, voice throaty and soft. Will met his gaze, seeking a reflection that simply wasn't there. It was not artifice or practice that made him seem vulnerable and undone in that moment, but the long-forgotten touch of human regret he thought he'd lost in the heart of the monster he'd become. With a fragility to rival the thinnest glass, he whispered,
Gone. In the past. And were you alone there?
Hannibal questioned him, tracing the arch of his eyebrow now, seemingly inattentive, utterly absorbed in committing the shape of Will's face to memory.
Yes,
Will bit out, torn between wanting to pull away to keep him guessing or simply leaning into him. He wasn't sure which one was more dangerous, Hannibal's temper or his strange, disaffected attention.
Always?
Hannibal asked him, fingers trailing into the heavy curls at Will's temple and seeking out the heat that had suddenly sprung there, unbidden, a mixture of finally being full and a sudden rush of half-remembered feelings.
Yes,
he said again, tipping his head. He rolled his eyes up to see Hannibal's expression, to try to suss out what was happening in the mind behind those dark eyes. The same dark eyes he found seeking his own, curious and deadly.
You're not alone anymore, Will,
he said, dropping his hand to Will's jaw, thumb parting Will's lips just slightly, just enough to see his eye teeth. Looking for the telltale sharpness, perhaps? Or maybe just searching for resistance. What will you let me do to you? Where do you balk? When will you fall to tears or outrage? That relentless, voracious need to know was the greater part of Dr. Hannibal Lecter, Will was fast discovering. Apparently satisfied, Hannibal lowered his hand entirely and moved quietly away to replace his drawing material on his desk, leaving Will to stand there in moiling silence, unsure of himself for the first time in a very long time, the taste of charcoal dust and, faintly, time in his mouth.
Get your clothing, Will,
Hannibal told him. Will noted with irritation that his usual mannered requests seemed to pare themselves down to tantamount orders in privacy.
I'll show you to your room.
Will slept well for the first time in decades, tucked into an oversized bed after a warm shower, all alone but for the thoughts he feared would keep him awake. He woke the next morning quite late by the feel of it, but then it had been nearly 3 a.m. by the time Hannibal had showed him upstairs. It was strangely funny to think about it now. Hannibal Lecter graciously pointing out the rooms of his house in passing, as Will slunk along behind him like some sort of pet, albeit a naked and rather sullenly perplexed one. Will lay in bed, touching the corner of his mouth where Hannibal's thumb had dipped between the seam of his lips to test his teeth. Again came the fluttering hope that Hannibal was like him, another monster in this world. That he just might have the answers to Will's questions. Where did we come from? Why are we like this? What are we? Vampire. That one had certainly crossed his mind. He could, and did, sustain his life by draining blood from the bodies of his victims. But it was never anything as elegant as the media would have people believe. No, it was messy, hot and meaty work, painful to the victim without Will's last question, without his special gift to give them in exchange for taking their life. He was no suave and sophisticated predator, as far as he knew, stalking about in dramatic clothing with good lighting and a host of willing victims. He was so far removed from the ideal that he simply could not be one of those elegant things. Demon, then. That felt closer to what he was, closer to the rage, anger, even hatred that had soured him over time. A monster in the guise of a troubled angel, innocent guile hiding a starving beast within. Something made of nightmares and illusion, existing on destruction and leaving death in its wake. Yes, that felt more like what he was. He only hoped Hannibal was what he seemed. A knock came at the door, a sharp rap of knuckles accompanied by Hannibal's low voice saying,
"Will, I don't generally do breakfast in bed. Get dressed and come down, please."
At least he said please, Will mused, and quickly stifled his urge to laugh.
"I'm still wearing what I had on last night,"
he said, meaning absolutely nothing. He hadn't been about to sleep in any part of that suit, not even the boxer briefs, and he had nothing else to wear.
"I've sent someone to fetch your bag from Matilda's. Until then, take a robe from the closet."
He heard the bare, soft noises of Hannibal moving away down the hallway, and made himself roll out of the comfortable bed. Debating a moment, he bent and smoothed the sheets and blankets into a semblance of order before dragging a large, black robe out of the closet. It was warm and comfortable, and only a touch too big in the shoulders, thankfully. He'd be swimming in one of Hannibal's tailored shirts, thanks to the smaller breadth of his shoulders. He might have filled out more had he grown past the place between youth and man, perhaps gained an inch to set him level with Hannibal, and shoulders to match in strength. Was it any wonder he felt such frustration? Every minuscule event, every tiny unimportant moment, every inch gained in height or length of hair that might have been, was all lost to him, a story without ending. The scent of eggs and sausage drifted up to him as he descended the stairs on silent, bare feet, his toes curling against the cold floors. The only carpeting he had seen so far was Hannibal's collection of pretentious rugs that probably cost a fortune. There was noise in the kitchen, but Will stopped in the dining room, seeing places set for two. Even this seemed to call for a nod to beauty, if the flowers and spiraling shells of the modest centerpiece were any indication.
"Good morning,"
Hannibal said, turning up behind him with silent grace bearing two plates, two more works of art.
"Did you sleep well?"
"Yes, thank you," Will murmured, sitting where Hannibal indicated he should, again at his right.
"This is fancy for just the two of us, isn't it? I enjoy beautiful things,"
Hannibal told him, looking relaxed and at ease. He was wearing slacks and a dress shirt, but no tie, the throat undone to the first button, the sleeves rolled back.
"Guess you already saw your appointment?"
Will gathered, taking a moment to appreciate the time and attention that had gone into what otherwise might have been a simple meal of sausage and eggs.
"One of them, yes. It is uncommon for me to accept appointments on weekends, but I try to accommodate. I'll have another in a short while, but there is always time for food, isn't there?"
It was so normal, this conversation. Pleasant and light commentary over eggs and a missing person who made a mighty delicious sausage, if Will had to say so himself. But this wasn't what he wanted. He wanted to know if Hannibal was like him, and the man was elusively refusing to give even a hint, appearing nothing more than a well-dressed, charismatic healer of the mind who had one very unusual preference in food sources. Will wanted to grab his face, much in the same way that Hannibal had grabbed his own last night, and push his lips back over his teeth just to see if they would be revealed in his surprise. He realized he was staring intently at Hannibal, who was chewing a bite of his food with relish and gazing placidly back at him, not a worry in the world.
"Does it bother you that I kill people?"
Will asked, a hard brittle edge to his words as his frustration pushed him from caution. The question was moot, considering that Hannibal had to get his supply of fresh protein from somewhere. It stood to reason he was a killer himself. Still, he had to ask it, had to see if there was some reaction, some sign. Another bite, petite and perfect, carefully chewed and swallowed before he said,
"No, Will, it doesn't."
"You asked me how I managed to whet my appetite like you expected it went deeper than hunger," Will said, plunging ahead, blissfully ignoring the warning signs his brain was giving him. "But you never asked me why I did it." Hannibal smiled slightly at him, his lids lowering to hood his dark eyes.
"Do you need a reason, Will? Isn't it enough that you can?"
"But I do have a reason, Dr. Lecter," Will purred, tensing, and sensing Hannibal tense in response. But no fear yet. Not now, and maybe not ever. Maybe not even when he asked his question, which was exactly what he planned to do should he discover Hannibal wasn't like himself. There was a hint of wry amusement in those dark amber eyes when Will rose from his chair, growing interest when he mounted the table in a rush of fluid, sleek muscle and grace. and downright consternation on his sculpted face when Will straddled his plate on his knees and stared down at him, the robe falling off of one shoulder, long undone. Hannibal gazed up at him, blinking slowly, and deliberately took the bite remaining on his fork unshaken. Softly, no hint of disapproval in his voice, he asked,
"Is there something you wish to tell me, Will?"
"Yes," Will said, practically sitting in his plate, the slide of his leg knocking his own from the slick tabletop where it hit his chair and fell to the floor, shattering in a priceless mess. But there would be more mess. There would be blood and pain, because if Hannibal was like himself, he would have shown it by now, if only to stave off a threat. "Because I'll die if I don't, is why I hunt them. Because I'm a monster, Dr. Lecter. Do you see?" He smiled, his lips parting so that Hannibal could see the full effect of his fangs slowly descending, thickening for rending, tapering to fine points so sharp a thought would draw blood.
"Yes, Will, I see,"
Hannibal murmured, that delighted smile widening, and still he wasn't afraid. It was almost maddening now. Will wanted him frightened, wanted him shaken. If Hannibal could not be what he hoped he would be, then he would be nothing more than an unfortunate crime scene left in Will's wake.
"Show me,"
Hannibal encouraged him, sitting back in his chair as if to gain a better view.
"Ganymede unleashed. Do you run them down like dumb beasts, Will? Or is yours a softer hunt, a consummation of the seduction you've perfected?"
He snarled and surged closer, going for Hannibal's throat, but pausing at the last second when Hannibal sighed.
"You're no monster, Will, but a work of art created by a master hand."
Will's eyes widened and he sat back suddenly, asking in a trembling rush, "Are you like me?" Hannibal was looking at him like he was something holy, some rare and delicate creature come with news from on high. Kneeling on his table, mostly bare and breathing hard, more animal than angel.
"No,"
Hannibal whispered, raw wonder in his voice. Not even being lunged at had shaken him. "Do you know what I am?" Will asked, the centuries falling away to leave him a boy barely into manhood, frightened and cast into a world with new definitions in a foreign language, with rules he couldn't quite seem to master.
"You,"
Hannibal said, eyes trailing from the crown of his curly head to the V of his spread legs to the bare tops of his thighs,
"are an exquisite dish yet uneaten, plated and parted, and ready to be served."
Will took a deep, shaking breath, confused and still angry, but no longer wanting to punish Hannibal for not being what he seemed. He was trembling so hard with the sudden shift that he felt weak with it. Lowering his head, he forced himself to look into Hannibal's dark brown eyes and quietly asked him, "What do you want from me?" He moved then, deadly silent, coming to his feet with a dancer's grace to cup Will's flushed face in his hands, holding him still, capturing him as much with his eyes as he had with his hands.
"I want to see that savage beauty of you unchained,"
he whispered, his breath pulsing over Will's trembling mouth.
"I want to see you freed from the weight of your past and reveling in your own power."
Will lifted his hands, gripping Hannibal's wrists, afraid he might pull away and tear a hole in his hope. Hannibal's smile revealed his own sharp, dangerous teeth in full, and he dipped his head even closer, lips brushing Will's own when he whispered,
"I want to see you hunt."
He twitched in Hannibal's hold, his breath leaving him in a rush, a bolt of almost sensual pleasure rocketing through him.
"Will you hunt for me?"
Hannibal asked, drinking in his trembling, their roles reversed, the wrong seams undone, the wrong creature exposed to the light of truth, and Will couldn't understand quite how it had happened. He'd never meant anything more in this long, lonely years of his life than he meant right now.
"Yes,"